Apply. Imagine a world where fear lurks in every corner, where the sound of footsteps in the streets carries not life but silence. A time when Europe was brought to its knees not by war. Apply. Not by kings, but by an invisible enemy that swept across the continent like wildfire. This was not just disease, this was terror, the Black Death. Tonight, apply. We journey back in the darkest chapter of European history, where cities crumbled, faith was tested, and families vanished overnight. Apply. What unfolded was not only a pandemic, it was a revolution in how people lived, believed, and fought for survival. Stay with us as we uncover chilling truths, shocking numbers, apply, and the secrets hidden in the plague's shadow. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, like, apply, and share your thoughts in the comments, because history like this should never be forgotten. In the heart of the 14th century, apply, Europe stood on the edge of an unimaginable catastrophe, and it began with a silent shadow that no one could see. The Black Death arrived like a storm without warning. Apply, sweeping across towns and villages, leaving devastation in its wake. Within months, entire communities were hollowed out. Apply, the sheer scale of death was unlike anything Europe had ever faced before. Nearly 25 million souls were lost, half the continent's population gone in just a few short years. Apply, imagine the impact. Streets that once bustled with merchants, laughter, and children's voices were reduced to eerie silence. Fields once tilled by hard-working peasants lay empty. Apply, crops rotting under the sun because there were no hands left to harvest them. The plague did not discriminate. It struck the poor huddled in their cottages. Apply, the wealthy in their palaces, priests in their churches, and even doctors who tried desperately to heal but fell victim themselves. It seemed as if death had become the only certainty. Apply, the numbers are staggering, but behind each statistic lies a story. Stories of families torn apart overnight, villages where only a handful of survivors remained. Apply, and cities where carts rolled through the streets piled high with bodies. Chroniclers of the time wrote of graveyards overflowing, forcing people to bury their dead in mass pits. Apply, sometimes without coffins, sometimes without prayers, because there was simply no time. Death came so quickly that many victims did not even live long enough to say goodbye. Apply, for those left behind, grief was overwhelming, but fear was even greater. Who would be next? No one knew. The invisible enemy moved from house to house, street to street. Apply, like a shadow that could not be outrun. The devastation was so vast that even those far removed from the epicenter felt its effects. Apply, merchants traveling along trade routes carried not just goods, but unknowingly carried death in their caravans and ships. The disease leapt from port to port, town to town. Apply, spreading faster than anyone could comprehend. A small outbreak in one village could, within weeks, ignite an entire region into chaos. People fled in desperation, abandoning their homes. Apply, their families, their land, hoping to escape the sickness. But no matter where they went, the Black Death seemed to follow. Some believed the air itself was poisoned. Apply, that a foul miasma carried the plague from one place to another. Others whispered of divine punishment, that humanity's sins had called down the wrath of heaven. Apply, whatever the explanation, the outcome was the same death on a scale that felt biblical. Apply, to understand what it meant to lose 25 million people in such a short time is to imagine the collapse of everything familiar. Labor vanished, communities disintegrated. Apply, and the very rhythm of daily life was shattered. In some towns, there were not enough living to bury the dead. Bells tolled endlessly until eventually they stopped. Apply, because there was no one left to ring them. Survivors described Europe as a place where death walked openly in the daylight, a constant companion that spared no one. And yet, apply, in the midst of despair, human resilience flickered faintly. Those who lived carried not only the memory of loss, but also the seeds of change that would reshape Europe forever. Apply, the sheer numbers tell us one story, the hard reality of destruction, but the silence left behind told another. Streets empty, fields untended, churches abandoned, markets gone quiet. Apply, it was as though the very heartbeat of Europe had been stilled. And yet, through that silence, history itself shifted. The Black Death was not just an event of staggering mortality. Apply, it was the beginning of a transformation, one that rose from the ashes of unimaginable loss. For centuries, the true cause of the Black Death remained cloaked in mystery. Apply, a terrifying puzzle that both terrified and confounded those who lived through it. To the people of 14th century Europe, there was no clear enemy to fight, no weapon to wield. Apply, no wall strong enough to hold back the tide of death that swept across the land. What they saw were neighbors struck down without warning. Apply, loved ones consumed by fever and blackened swellings, whole families lost in a matter of days. In the desperation to explain the unexplainable, the human imagination filled the void. Apply, some believed that the air itself had turned toxic, poisoned by strange celestial alignments or the wrath of God. Others whispered that it was the Jews, Apply, accused falsely of poisoning wells, leading to horrifying waves of persecution and massacres. Many clung to the idea that divine punishment had descended upon mankind. apply that the sins of Europe had brought this nightmare to life. And with no science to guide them, these beliefs hardened into truths. But behind the walls of every home, apply. Hidden in the rafters of every barn, in the holds of every ship, the real culprits were at work, tiny unseen creatures that no one in medieval Europe could comprehend. Apply. The plague was carried by fleas riding on the backs of black rats that traveled alongside human beings as silent passengers. They slipped into cargo holds, scurried through granaries, apply, and multiplied in the darkness of medieval cities, feeding off scraps left behind by human settlements. Each flea carried within it a microscopic killer, Yersinia pestis, apply, a bacterium unknown to science until centuries later. It was this invisible army, not divine, fury that unleashed the most devastating pandemic Europe had ever seen. Apply. The tragedy was cruel in its simplicity. Fleas infected by the bacterium would bite rats, and when those rats died in droves, the fleas turned to the next available host, humans. Apply. The bites delivered a microscopic poison into the bloodstream, and soon the victim's body erupted with painful swellings, high fever, and unstoppable weakness. Within days, apply. Life was extinguished. The chain of infection was unstoppable because it was unseen. Rats traveled with merchants, with soldiers, with pilgrims. Apply. They scuttled across docks and climbed aboard ships, carrying death across seas and into ports. No border was strong enough to block them, no prayer powerful enough to stop them. And yet, apply, for the people of that era, the connection was impossible to make. They saw the symptoms, but not the source. They burned herbs to cleanse the air, wore strange masks filled with spices, apply, and walked through streets clutching flowers to their noses, convinced it would ward off the poison. They lashed out at outsiders, searching for scapegoats, apply, because it was easier to blame enemies than to accept the crushing truth that death came from something they could not even see, apply. Whole communities of Jews were slaughtered in horrific pogroms, accused of crimes they never committed. Wanderers, beggars, and even the innocent were punished, yet the plague raged on, apply, unstoppable, because the true killer was not human at all. It would take centuries for science to reveal what Europe could not grasp in its darkest hour. Apply. The microscopes that uncovered bacteria, the experiments that traced disease to tiny organisms, apply, and the discoveries that explained how infection truly spread, all of that knowledge was still far away. In the 14th century, apply. People lived in a world where the cause of death was invisible, where faith and fear were the only tools they had to fight back. Apply. The mystery of the Black Death's origin only deepened their terror, because how could you fight what you could not name? And yet, will apply. Hidden in that mystery was the seed of something extraordinary. Though no one then could understand the plague's true cause, apply. The devastation it left behind would one day push humankind toward new ways of questioning, observing, and seeking answers beyond superstition. Apply. Out of the silence left by the rats and fleas came a new hunger to understand the unseen, and though the people of medieval Europe could not know it, apply. Their suffering laid the first stones on the path toward modern medicine. When the Black Death swept through Europe, it did more than take lives. It shook the very foundations of belief. Apply, breaking the unspoken contract people thought they had with heaven. For generations, the church had been the unshakable center of existence. It was the voice of comfort, apply, the guardian of salvation, the place where hope was found in times of fear. But as the plague struck, merciless and relentless prayers went unanswered. Apply, bells tolled for the dead until even the priests who rang them were silenced by the disease. Suddenly, apply, the holy men who were supposed to intercede with God were themselves collapsing in the streets, their robes soaked in sweat, apply, their bodies blackened by the same swellings that consumed peasants and nobles alike. Faith, once an unbreakable fortress, began to crack. Everywhere, apply, people turned desperately to the church for answers. Why was this happening? Was this the wrath of God? Could forgiveness save them? In countless villages, apply, priests stood at altars and begged their congregations to repent, to pray harder, to confess every sin, no matter how small. But as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, apply, the plague did not relent. The faithful saw their neighbors perish, their children vanish, their villages empty. The silence that followed their prayers became unbearable. Apply, many began to whisper the unthinkable. Perhaps the church did not have the answers after all. The crisis revealed a stark truth. Apply, the church had always claimed authority not only over the soul but also over knowledge, yet when faced with the plague, apply, it offered only rituals and ceremonies that failed to halt the horror. Priests carried crosses through the streets, blessing the dying, but they died themselves in staggering numbers. Apply, monks in cloisters, devoted to lives of piety, fell victim just as quickly as the sinners they condemned. Even the Pope, sheltered in Avignon, apply, ordered great fires to be lit around his palace, hoping to purify the air and keep the disease at bay. He survived, but thousands of priests across Europe did not. Apply, entire parishes were left leaderless. In some towns, not a single cleric remained to bury the dead. forcing ordinary men and women to perform rites themselves. Apply, or worse, to cast loved ones into mass graves without ceremony. For ordinary believers, this collapse of spiritual leadership was devastating. If holy men could not survive, apply. If prayers could not stop the pestilence, then what power did the church really hold? Doubt, once a dangerous spark, now grew into flame. Some people clung more fiercely to faith, apply, joining flagellant movements that roamed from city to city, whipping themselves in public processions, believing that extreme penance might soften God's anger. Apply. Others abandoned religion altogether, embracing despair or wild indulgence, convinced that nothing mattered because death was inevitable. The authority of the church, once absolute, apply, now seemed fragile, even hollow. The plague had exposed a fault line in Europe's spiritual world. It revealed that divine protection was not guaranteed. Apply, that sacred rituals were powerless against nature's fury. In the centuries to come, this collapse of confidence would ripple outward, paving the way for great upheaval skepticism. Apply, reform, and eventually the questioning spirit that would define the Renaissance and Reformation. But in the moment, for those who lived through it, apply, the collapse of faith was deeply personal. It meant kneeling at an altar in tears and realizing that no miracle was coming. Apply. It meant watching priests die alongside beggars and realizing that holiness was no shield. It meant staring at a world stripped bare of certainty. Apply, where even God's silence was deafening. The Black Death did not just ravage bodies, it ravaged trust. The walls of faith, once towering and impenetrable, were scarred and broken. Apply. In their place grew a different way of seeing the world, one that no longer accepted authority. Without question, it was a wound in the soul of Europe, and from that wound, apply, a new chapter in human history began to bleed forth. Fear during the Black Death was not just an emotion, it was the air itself, thick, choking, inescapable. Apply, to live in Europe in those years was to wake each morning unsure if the day would end with life or death. Apply. The streets were filled with the creak of wooden wheels as carts carried the dead through towns, their bodies stacked like cordwood, covered hastily with rags or straw. Apply. Families locked themselves inside their homes, peering through cracks in the shutters, praying the sound of coughing outside would pass them by. Even the act of breathing felt dangerous. Apply. For many believed the very air carried the poison of the plague. Doctors appeared like figures from a nightmare, dressed in long cloaks, leather gloves. Apply, and the grotesque beaked masks stuffed with herbs and flowers meant to purify the foul air. To children, they looked like creatures from another world. To the dying, apply, they were symbols of both hope and dread, men who sometimes brought small comfort, but more often carried the reputation of failure. For few they treated survived. Apply. The sight of these doctors walking slowly through the streets was enough to make entire neighborhoods tremble. Fear became a constant companion, pressing down on every waking thought. Apply. In villages, silence replaced laughter. In stood empty markets were abandoned, schools closed. People avoided one another, terrified that even a touch might bring death. Apply. Neighbors who once shared bread now refused to meet each other's eyes. Mothers turned away from their own children when fevers rose. Apply. Fathers fled from homes where the sickness had entered, convinced that to stay was to die. Trust unraveled, bonds broke apart. Apply, and isolation became the only defense people thought they had. The plague had not only killed millions, it had killed the very idea of community. Apply. Superstition flourished in this atmosphere of dread. Strange sights filled the roads, groups of flagellants stripped to the waist. Apply. Marching from town to town as they whipped their own backs until blood ran down their skin. They believed that by suffering openly, apply, they could cleanse the world of sin and earn God's forgiveness, ending the plague. Crowds gathered to watch these grim parades, their chants echoing through the night. Apply. But even as the lashes fell and the prayers grew louder, the plague raged on, indifferent. When hope failed, suspicion took its outsiders, foreigners, even friends became targets. Apply. People accused strangers of carrying poison, of casting curses, of spreading death deliberately. Whole communities of Jews were slaughtered in massacres born of fear and ignorance. Apply. The world had become a place where fear justified cruelty, and cruelty left scars deeper than disease. Inside the cities, horror was constant. Apply. Bells tolled endlessly as priests tried to keep up with the dying. At night, the glow of torches lit up graveyards where pits were dug, yawning wide to swallow hundreds at a time. Apply. People whispered that the ground itself was cursed, unable to contain so many bodies. Survivors walked through streets where the smell of decay never lifted. Apply. Where every shadow carried the threat of infection. Even animals were feared. Cats and dogs were killed in huge numbers, believed to carry the sickness, though ironically, apply, their absence only allowed rats to multiply, spreading the plague further. This was a world where fear dictated every decision, every breath. People abandoned their families. Apply, fled from cities or barricaded themselves in homes stocked with food, hoping isolation might spare them. Some turned to indulgence, feasting and drinking in a frenzy of pleasure. Apply. Convinced that tomorrow might never come, others clung desperately to ritual, to prayers, to charms and amulets, searching for any shred of protection, yet no matter how they responded, apply. The plague moved forward, unstoppable, cutting through walls, through prayers, through hope itself. To live through the Black Death was to inhabit a world without certainty. Apply. Where death walked side by side with the living and fear was the one constant companion. It shaped every thought, every action, every heartbeat, and even after the plague began to fade, apply. The memory of that fear remained etched into the minds of survivors, a shadow they could never escape, a reminder that safety was an illusion. Apply, and that life could be torn away in the space of a single breath. When the Black Death tore across Europe, it did more than decimate lives. It dismantled the very machinery of society. Apply. Every death was not just a personal loss, but a missing link in the chain that kept the medieval world turning. Fields lay untended as peasants collapsed in their cottages. Apply. Harvests rotted where they grew, and livestock wandered ownerless through the countryside. Markets that once thrived with the chatter of merchants and buyers became eerily silent. Apply. The web of trade and labor, stretched thin across kingdoms, began to unravel strand by strand. Europe was not just mourning, it was starving. Apply. The sudden disappearance of so many workers sent shockwaves into the feudal system, the rigid hierarchy that had defined life for centuries. Lords, apply, who once commanded endless labor from their serfs, suddenly found their estates in ruin. Crops withered in unplowed fields, castles lacked servants, and armies lost soldiers. Apply. For the first time, the balance of power tilted, not in favor of kings or nobles, but in favor of the survivors. With so many hands lost, apply. The peasants who remained discovered their work had become precious. Their labor, once taken for granted, now carried bargaining power. Apply. Many refused to return to the same harsh conditions, demanding higher wages or even freedom from servitude. In village after village, lords were forced to concede. Will apply, not out of kindness but desperation. Survival demanded it. The old order shook under this pressure. The very foundation of feudalism, an abundance of cheap apply obedient labor, was crumbling. Landowners tried to resist, enacting harsh laws to freeze wages and tie peasants to the land. Apply. But laws written on parchment could not replace the tens of millions who had vanished. Peasants walked away from their masters, some moving into towns where guilds welcomed their skills. Apply. Others negotiating new contracts that gave them freedoms unheard of before. Out of the plague's devastation emerged the first flickers of social mobility. Apply. A shift that would echo across generations. The cities, too, felt the tremors. Merchants who survived faced a world where supply chains were broken, demand had collapsed. Apply, and yet opportunities suddenly arose. With fewer competitors, some merchants grew richer, while others lost everything. Entire industries staggered under the loss of skilled craftsmen. Apply. In places like Florence, workshops closed and artistic production slowed, only to roar back decades later in a burst of creativity fueled by the new social and economic order. Apply. Wealth began to concentrate in new hands, creating a class of survivors who would later sponsor the art, science, and exploration of the Renaissance. Apply. The plague did not only reshape work and wealth, it altered the very psychology of money. With so many dead, inheritance flowed unpredictably. Apply. Vast fortunes passed suddenly into the hands of widows, distant relatives, even strangers. Families that had been obscure rose suddenly to prominence, while dynasties collapsed overnight. Apply. The old assumptions of stability and continuity were swept aside. Life felt fragile, fleeting, and so did wealth. People spent more freely, indulging in comforts and luxuries. Apply. Convinced that tomorrow was never guaranteed. This shift in spending further eroded the rigid frugality of the medieval mindset and sowed seeds of a new economic culture. Apply. But the transformation was not smooth. Governments, desperate to maintain control, imposed taxes and restrictions, trying to force the world back into its old shape. In England, apply. The Statute of Laborers was passed in 1351, attempting to cap wages at pre-plague levels and keep peasants bound to their lords. The result was resentment. Apply. Simmering anger that would eventually erupt into revolts like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Across Europe, these tensions flared. Apply, proving that the plague had not only weakened bodies but loosened the bonds of obedience. The Black Death had left Europe poorer in lives, but paradoxically, apply, it made survivors richer in power. Labor shortages shattered centuries of social order, lifting some from bondage, giving others new voices. Apply, and igniting a slow but unstoppable transformation of the economy. From the ashes of despair, peasants became negotiators, merchants became kings of commerce. Apply, and the rigid walls of feudalism began to crack. What had once been an unshakable system was revealed to be fragile, vulnerable to a single invisible enemy. Apply. The economic shockwaves of the Black Death rippled far beyond its years. They laid the groundwork for revolutions in thought, in trade, and in society itself. Apply. In the silence left by abandoned fields and empty markets, a new Europe was beginning to take shape. one where the value of human labor had been rewritten, apply, and the world would never again return to what it once was. From the ashes of unimaginable despair, something unexpected began to stir in Europe after the Black Death, apply. The plague had swept away nearly half the population, leaving silence where there had once been life, but it also left space for new ideas, new voices, apply, and new ways of living to take root. Survivors looked upon a changed world and realized that the structures had once seemed eternal were not unbreakable. The church, apply, shaken by its inability to protect or explain, no longer held the same absolute grip over minds. The old feudal system, weakened by labor shortages, apply, could no longer bind peasants as tightly to the land. With so much destroyed, there was suddenly room to rebuild, and out of that void came the beginning of transformation. Medicine, apply, though still primitive, began to edge toward progress. Physicians, scarred by the helplessness they had endured, started questioning the old theories of humors and divine punishment. Apply, they observed, recorded, and debated. Hospitals slowly adapted to provide care that went beyond prayer, and new attention was given to hygiene, sanitation, and the spread of disease. Apply. Though the plague's cause remained misunderstood for centuries, the devastation it wrought planted a restless hunger for knowledge. The world had revealed how fragile human life was, apply, and the survivors longed to understand it better. This hunger would one day blossom into scientific inquiry and the medical revolutions of later centuries. Society, too, apply, bore the mark of rebirth. The scarcity of workers gave common people new leverage, and with it, new confidence. No longer silent, they demanded wages, better treatment, and freedom. Apply, many moved to towns and cities, joining guilds, becoming merchants, carving out lives that would have been impossible before the plague. Apply. The rigid lines of class began to blur ever so slightly, and the whispers of social mobility grew louder. The seeds of change, though small, apply, would grow into movements that reshaped Europe in ways unthinkable before the plague. Culturally, the trauma of the Black Death etched itself into art and literature. Apply. Writers describe visions of death, of decay, of the fragility of existence. Painters filled canvases with images of skeletal figures and dance macabres. Apply. Grim reminders of life's brevity. Yet alongside this darkness came a renewed celebration of life itself. People, aware of how quickly it could vanish, turned toward joy, beauty, apply, and creation. When the Renaissance dawned in Italy decades later, its energy was fueled in part by the awareness born in the plague years that life was precious, fleeting, apply, and worth expressing in its fullest brilliance. The focus shifted from purely spiritual salvation to human potential, to the power of the mind, to the beauty of the world itself. Apply. The plague had also redrawn the map of Europe's spirit. Faith had been shaken, but not destroyed. In its place, questioning grew. Apply. People no longer accepted every word handed down by authority without thought. They began to wonder, to doubt, to seek their own truths. Apply. This subtle shift laid the foundations for revolutions to come, religious reforms, political upheavals, and intellectual awakenings. The Black Death had not simply ended an era, apply, it had cracked open the door to a new one. Even the land itself bore the marks of change. Villages abandoned during the plague became ghostly reminders, apply, swallowed by forests or left as ruins. But in other places, survivors inherited lands, farms, and wealth, creating opportunities for growth and expansion. Apply. The redistribution of property altered power structures and gave rise to families who would shape Europe's future. Apply. The cycle of destruction and rebirth echoed through every layer of society, reminding survivors that life, though fragile, could also be remade. Apply. The Black Death was not only a story of death, but of beginnings. Out of fear came curiosity. Out of silence came voices demanding change. Out of ruin came the spark of rebirth. Apply. Europe emerged scarred, yes, but also transformed, its people hardened, its spirit restless, its future forever altered. The plague had torn the old world apart, but in doing so, apply cleared the ground for something entirely new to grow. And from that darkness, a new era began to rise.